Well, welcome everyone. So as Tom said, I'm a research fellow at the University of Exeter in the UK. I'll just start with a bit of and today I'll be speaking about insights about human behavior for protected area management and conservation. And I'll start with a bit of the disclaimers, and that's because when I had a look at the schedule and who else was speaking and the topics, and I felt a bit like an outlier. And because, so first, although the day is about large-scale conservation, I often focus on quite small case studies where I'm, for example, working on small-scale fisheries. And although I'm saying small-scale fisheries, we need to take into account that roughly 9 out of 10 fishers all over the world are actually small-scale fishers. And that from small-scale fishing, we take roughly half of all the fishing harvest all over the world. So although these might be quite small case studies, when we put everything together, they're quite important in the number of people involved and importance for their livelihoods and also conservation impacts. Another thing is that I've noticed that everyone is speaking about the sea, but in my research, I actually have case studies about the sea and about land. And I think that's because it's quite important to draw comparisons. And because when we are speaking with resource users, such as people fishing or hunting, it's people making decisions about how much to take from the sea or the land. And it's people making decisions about how to make decisions a protected area. So I think it makes sense to focus on marine and land. And finally, as Tom was saying, I am a biologist, but I mostly focus on the social dimensions of conservation and resource use. And that's really because nowadays we see an increasing role for conservation social science. So when I say conservation social science, I'm speaking about many different fields. So it could be conservation marketing, psychology, economics, environmental education. So they all fit under this wider umbrella of conservation social science. But I think, especially maybe over the last 10 years, we are starting to see this recognition that if we really want to address sustainability challenges, we need to involve a wide range of people and a wide range of complex trade-offs that there might be at stake. So what I'll mostly do, I focus on that end bit about the decision-making and development at the local and individual level. Those are key also to inform any policy decisions and conservation interventions. So it's really important to have a wide number of researchers that sit within this gradient and work together. Because policies need to be, for policies to work, they need to be supported by a good local context, and to have a good understanding of implementation, I think it's important to consider the local and regional and global scales. So having said that, my goals for today are using a few case studies to illustrate how social research can be really useful for improving protected area management and conservation, and then to identify a few challenges and opportunities, basically recommendations for large-scale conservation. I'll start with one case study, which is about marine protected area management in Saint Thomas and Principe. So Saint Thomas and Principe is quite a small archipelago in the Gulf of Guinea, and I've started working there some time ago. And this project is evolving to be about establishing a new protected area. So there's still no protection in place. This is still the start. And so what I'll tell you today is a bit about the type of things we should think about even before we have these protections in place. The work I do is mainly in the island of Principe, which is quite small. There's only 8,000 people on the island. It has been a UNESCO reserve since 2012. And as with many places like that all over the world, it's quite a poor country, and people are very reliant on fishing, both for income and food. So we have roughly 2/3 of the population below the poverty line, and this is one of the countries where consumption of fish is highest. So of course, we don't have a lot of people, but they rely a lot on fish, And themselves, they are the ones saying, well, we have been seeing problems in the abundance and types of fish that we are able to catch nowadays. And so these problems are problems a bit that we find in many, many different places. So we've been seeing catch decline. We've been seeing top-down approaches that don't really seem to work. And there's also a general lack of resources to solve the problem at state level. And although these are quite common problems, we also know that in many places, people have been focusing on testing few different potential solutions. So we have, for example, engagement, community participation, we have marine spatial planning, we have co-management as potential solutions that people have been calling for. So the project really started on focusing how to promote engagement of fishers and fish traders in these small islands. And the focus of the project, we phrased it as improving empowerment of small-scale fishing communities. So in this case, and it's quite common, women are fish traders and the men are the fishers. And so this was a project also focusing on gender issues. So we wanted to empower both of the genders. And so this case study was really about the definition of empowerment and how we can actually use empowerment as a tool that we can facilitate and we can use to promote certain management implications. So my call here, my first call of warning, let's say, is that empowerment is often used as a, let's say, a conservation buzzword. So we say that we want to empower people, but what do we actually mean with that? And what kind of implications does it actually have? So this study was about finding what could be driving empowerment and what could be the management implications of the empowerment. And I started by basically developing this type of framework where empowerment, based on literature and based on discussions with these communities, where empowerment sat as a component, a dimension within poverty. And so basically what I did was I developed, let's say, a study framework, and these are different variables that I aim to collect. So for example, so that I could look at empowerment at individual and community level, I needed to collect information on community compliance, enforcement, involvement in community decisions, freedom of choice, access to opportunities, and so on. So these are the variables that I was looking at. And I define, although empowerment can be defined in many different ways, for this study, we defined it as the belief in the personal ability to influence marine protection or collective ability to influence marine protection. And there were basically a few statements, and people needed to score their agreement or disagreement with these type of statements. So this is just the type of information we asked with the questionnaire. We did questionnaires all over the island. We interviewed more than 800 people, which is quite a lot in such a small island, and in different communities, some of them fishing communities and others not fishing. And so what have we found? So when we brought all the information together, we found that actually their level of empowerment, or in other words, the level to which they felt themselves they were able to influence marine protection, was mainly explained by their level of belief in state enforcement, in collective influence, freedom of choice and action, perceived condition of the local marine environment, and if they were living in the coastal community. So what does it mean? It means that, for example, if I felt that the state was playing an important role and doing a good job in terms of enforcing fishing rules, then I felt that myself, I was more able to actually protect the environment. And that's quite interesting because it shows if a project, it's only focusing on working with fishing communities, to which point can actually empower them on creating engagement if we are not also focusing on improving enforcement and working with the government. So there are many different considerations that we need to invest on, and it's not worth focusing only on fishers if we are not improving capacity at other levels. And for example, quite interestingly, people that felt, they said, I don't know how the sea is doing, I don't know nothing about the environment, they were less likely to believe that they had the ability to change something about it. So these kind of variables are quite important for us to know how to work with these communities, what type of messages we need to use with them. And also we found that people that were more empowered, they were more likely to recommend creating no fishing areas and raising awareness about sustainability of fishing as management practices. So we were able to link management recommendations to environmental levels, which is quite useful for us to actually know what's viable, feasible within a study area. So as a general recommendation, really, empowerment is another metric that we could be thinking about for wider conservation initiatives. But there is much more, from a social science perspective, many more dimensions of empowerment that we could be focusing on. And also conducting wider scale assessments of these metrics. Now, very rapidly, another case study, this is being led by a PhD student of mine. And although she's focusing on a very remote protected area, which is Biot in the Indian Ocean, this has been a protected area since 2010, but there are not any local communities there. So in a way, it has everything to work, because there's no local communities that could be fishing, that could be not complying with resources, but illegal fishing is still ongoing, and that's because fishers from Sri Lanka and India are going there to catch sharks, among other species. So instead of spending time in Biot, the actual protected area, she's spending a lot of time in very smelly fishing markets in India and Sri Lanka, right? So she's going straight to the source where the fishes are, and she's trying to address drivers for this type of behavior. So she's focusing on doing socioeconomic assessment, trying to understand what's driving their decisions. So why are they going to Biot to catch these sharks? First, focusing on the economic drivers. So she collected a lot of data on landing surveys, how much money they were selling these species for, weight, size, and so on. And so, for example, with this type of information, she's then able to draw a diagram of all these connections between the different players in the trade chain, right? So who's fishing, who's buying, where this is being taken to, and how much money people are making from all this trade. And this is quite an interesting side of the problem. But very quickly, she found out that it wasn't really enough to focus on this economic component. And she started putting a number of questions about what could actually be causing illegal fishing. And although socioeconomic reliance on sharks, yes, it does seem to be very important, there's other factors that she needed to better understand. So, for example, are these fishers actually aware of regulations? And yes, do they agree with the regulations? And what's their perception towards specific regulations? Also, what are their perceptions of change in shark abundance, and so on? So it wasn't really enough to focus on the economic component, and there's so many more social factors that could be playing a role. So basically, she went back and she started collecting more, let's say, more qualitative information that it's also quite interesting to try and understand illegal trade. So, for example, she found that although they are generally aware of certain regulations, or for example, having to discard species, they were, let's say, against wastage. They don't want to just waste something, and so they decide that, yes, they are going to keep that shark and they are going to land it, although that's against the rules. And, for example, she was also trying to assess their perceptions of how much other people comply. Because if I know that other people are not complying, I don't really have a strong incentive for complying myself, right? So see, these are related to economics, but they are much more broader than that. And so they tell a really interesting other side of the story. And finally, a case study which is not marine at all. This is about the Serengeti in Tanzania. And the Serengeti, although people are not allowed to live inside the national park or hunt or whatever, there's roughly 2 million people living on the border of the Serengeti. And these are very poor communities that mainly rely on natural resources, but due to the regulations, they're not allowed to hunt, not even within their communities, right? So they can't go inside the national park, but also they can't do it within their communities because it's too close to the park. So I started by, we wanted to understand this, again, this illegal bushmeat hunting. And I started by putting together all the reports and all the studies that people had done about that, about the Serengeti. And we found that there were quite a few papers, but a lot of them, they were really contradicting themselves. So if we wanted to know how many people were involved in hunting, illegal hunting, the prevalence was ranging from 8 to 57% of households. When we're speaking about 2 million people, this is a very significant difference. For management purposes, it's very different if we have to deal with 8% of people or 57% of people. And then when they were assessing socioeconomic drivers, there was a long list of potential drivers that the people were identifying, and sometimes they were also not telling a coherent story. But if you started reading those reports and studies in more detail, it was quite interesting to find out that maybe the way the questions were being made was not right. Because, for example, in one paper, the authors wrote that 84% of the participants in a questionnaire chose not to reply to the question about being engaged in illegal hunting. Another author said there was a deep reluctance among respondents to talk about hunting, and collected data needs to be treated cautiously due to fear from respondents. So it means that, yes, social researchers were asking questions, but people were not really willing to give information. So how can we make decisions based on that? It's quite tricky. What I did, I thought, well, you know, maybe this is a common problem. Let me go to the social sciences and read about how other people might be dealing with it. And I found out that, well, you know, people lie, many different places all over the world, many different problems. So there is actually a field within the social sciences that has been focusing on developing ways of addressing this type of problem. And this has been going since the 50s, 60s. So there's many different papers about how to address non-response and social desirability and so on. And I came across with this technique, which is called the unmatched count technique. And so what I'll do, I'll briefly tell you how it goes. So let's say if I was using this technique with you, I would randomly allocate 50% of you to the control card and 50% of you to the treatment card. So far, so good. And then people that, let's say you got the control card, you would see 4 activities, which within the Serengeti, there are activities that people generally do, like farming and trading. And I would ask you, how many activities within this card do you do for cash, let's say? And you would say, for example, 2, I do 2 activities, 3 activities, but you would never tell me which ones, just how many, right? But the thing is, people getting the treatment card, they get exactly the same card plus hunting. So it's exactly the same card, but it does include hunting, which is the sensitive behavior I want to know. And again, you get the same question. So how many activities do you do? But let's say if from the control card, I know that the mean number of activities is 2, but from the treatment card, I know the mean number of activities is 2.4, the difference is the prevalence of people involved in hunting. This means that I'm not able to say if you are engaged in a certain behavior, so it protects your privacy. Also, it means that at general level, like within this room, I would be able to know roughly how many people are involved in a certain behavior, but I'm still able to link to social and demographic variables because I can still apply some kind of regression and get the information I need. So I went back, I found out about this technique, I decided to have a go, went back to the Serengeti, we did more than 1,000 interviews using this technique, and what have we found? That first extremely good result is that less than 3% of people said, I don't want to give you information about hunting, right? So the response rate increased greatly. Then we were able to quantify hunting in the area. The one thing with this technique is that basically what it does is it adds random, let's say, noise to the sample. So the standard errors, they increase quite a lot. So we are less certain about the estimate, but at least we have an estimate that we can make some decisions about. And then we found that poaching remains widespread and that people were doing it. They were catching bushmeat for cash, but also for food all year round. And then we were also able to link their behavior to certain economic drivers. And for example, we found that although they were being provided with alternative economic sources, those were not enough because they were still making more money from hunting. And so it was worth for them to keep doing hunting, even if they were being arrested for, because they could very easily pay the fine, right? So using this technique, you can do as usual and do a socioeconomic analysis and so on. And even more good news is that, as I said, this is a field of study, and so there's other different ways that you can use, other different tools that you can use to address this type of problem in conservation and resource management. So just to finish, general challenges from these case studies, and that we can say that it's quite common in large-scale conservation, is that yes, it is important to collect social information, but also we need to think about how reliable that information is, right? So these techniques, they need to be applied by people that understand the challenges, that can understand what the techniques are saying, and also you need to have a lot of local context to be able to interpret the social information you're getting. Then, although I was mainly focusing on small-scale fishers or hunters, within my work, I work with NGOs, governments, fisheries departments, and everyone has a different interest. So when you're doing social work, social research, you have to take these different stakeholders into account and work with all of those. There's very complex trade-offs, especially when you're working with developing countries or very poor communities, for example, related with sustainable development goals. And there are many different dimensions of nature. So it's not really enough thinking about the economics if you're not thinking about cultural drivers or other social factors. But there are a lot of opportunities, I would say. And so conservation social science can be really important within large conservation for the marine, for the sea, related, for example, to informing effective policy. For example, how and when and how exactly plan stakeholder engagement. So how should we go about working with different people, and where should we focus? Which tools do we need to use? Then social information can be useful to define enforcement and what type of rules need to be put in place, and also define metrics. So how can we evaluate impacts of protected areas? There are many, many different tools, and there are many, many lessons across fields. And finally, I think it is really, it's quite easy to understand that there's so much information, and technology is allowing us to get so much more information about the decisions people are making and the values they have, that this is quite a big opportunity, well, if used properly. And we should take advantage of all of that. We should promote stakeholder involvement towards common visions, and I think this is really key for long-term sustainability so that we can remain positive about conservation and the oceans. Thank you so much.
Any questions? Do we have a mic here?
Yeah, first, thank you for your presentation. It was really awesome. I have one question. What are all the parameters you took into account when making the cards you distributed to everyone?
Do you mean the design of the card?
Yeah, what made you choose like teaching or farming, or why was it? Why wasn't it anything else?
Yeah, that's actually a good question, because you know sometimes people underestimate how much thought it goes into designing these cards. So first thing is you need to avoid having people to say, I don't do any of those, or I do all of those, right? Sure. So there's only, so first you start by making a list of potential activities. I focus on activities just because it was easier to explain. And there always needs to be one item that almost everyone does. And so in the Serengeti, almost everyone did some type of farming. Okay. So that means that I don't get zeros in my database. Also, there needs to be something that almost no one does, and that's teaching. There's almost no teachers, right? And so that means I don't get 5s. Because if I got a 5, I knew that that specific person was involved in hunting, okay. And so it removes their privacy. With such a large sample size, it might still happen that I do find a teacher that was actually hunting and doing everything else, okay. But I need to take that into account. So that's the first. Then, for example, the drawings, they were taken from primary school books. So you need to make sure that the cards, and they were in Swahili, this is just the English version for you. So you need to make sure that the cards, they are relevant and easy to understand by the specific people. So these were locally relevant drawings that people could understand, even if they couldn't read, because a lot of people, they couldn't read. So although I had the name of the activities, a lot of people were looking at the actual drawing. Okay. And then there's, you have to conduct a pilot study, which is very, very important. You need to assess if the technique is actually work. So in addition to this technique, I had 3 or 4 other techniques that I was taking into account. And I did a pilot study to try and understand which one was easier to apply, if people like the technique. So, you know, I really like this technique, but it does require a lot of thought. Okay, that's about to make it actually make it work. And I think that's a key message, is that people also, they get excited about new tools. And nowadays you have a lot of people that say, oh, yes, I'm going to go and do a questionnaire, and they do it. And sometimes they're not really asking the right questions, or sometimes they're not really even appropriate to use for that local setting, right? So using social information in conservation, it requires a lot of collaboration with other people and thoughts about how to do it properly.
Thank you.
We're a little bit over time, so just one more quick question.
Yeah, one question about the Sao Tome study. If we believe the forecast from ecosystem models, we know that area will be hit by climate change very heavily and negatively. Are the people aware of it? Do they feel empowered to make things change?
Well, so first, there is actually I think it's a World Bank climate change adaptation program there. And some of these specific fishing communities where I was working, they are being slightly relocated because they've been already seeing the sea destroying their fishing areas or going a bit inside their houses. So they are actively trying to relocate people a bit towards inland. And because these are such small communities, having that type of program, it means that they might not really fully understand, but they were speaking about, yes, there's a climate change program because we are being affected. So I don't know, I wasn't there before the program started, so I don't know if they were already very aware of the issue, of this is something due to the program, but this is something they were telling me about. It's becoming a bit more challenging for them because it means they can't be on the coast anymore, so there's more effort so that they carry on.
And also the empowerment to make things change is different if it's a local threat. If it's fishing with a marine protected area, you can do something, but if it's climate change, it's more difficult.
I think for the climate change, they were a bit more, well, there's a program, they're basically providing this for us. They weren't really actively trying to solve it for themselves. I think it's...
Thank you.
The scale and the challenge is different.
Okay, thanks very much, Anna.
Thank you.